The Odyssey. The house had been dying for 10 years. You could smell it from the road below the citadel, where the goat tracks came up through the olive terraces, and the salt wind off the strait carried the news of every cooking fire on the hill. There were too many fires now. The hall of Odysseus burned through its wood piles faster than any house had a right to, and a stranger walking up from the harbour at dusk might have thought a small army was wintering there, or that some great lord kept open table in the old generous fashion. He would have been wrong on both counts. There was no lord. The men eating their way through the larders were not soldiers, and the welcome they enjoyed was a thing they had taken, never a thing they had been given. They called themselves suitors. The word had grown teeth in the saying of it. There were 108 of them, more or less, and the number rose or fell with whichever of the lesser islands had sent up its hungry second sons that month. They came for the queen. The queen was a widow, or near enough to one that the difference had become a technicality kept alive by a single stubborn woman. And a widow of the right kind was a doorway. Marry her, and you married the rock of Ithaca, the harbour that held the strait, the herds on the mainland shore, the name men still spoke with a lowering of the voice. None of them wanted Penelope. They wanted the chair she sat beside, and they were content to eat her dead husband's kingdom down to the bone while they waited for her to admit he was never coming home. So they did. Each day they killed her pigs and her goats and the long-horned cattle bred on the mainland for 4 generations. Each day the wine that old Laertes had laid down in his strong years came up from the cellars and spilled out across a floor that no one scrubbed anymore. The serving women learned which of the men to avoid in the dark passages and which ones it was safer to lie still for. Some of them stopped avoiding any of it at all, because a girl who took a powerful man's favour ate better than a girl who kept her honour in a house where honour had stopped buying bread. The minstrel sang because they made him sing. The old hound by the gate had not been brushed or fed in so long that the lice had stripped the hair from his haunches. And he lay in the cattle dung and the spilled barley and waited, with the terrible patience of animals, for a master who did not come. This was the kingdom. This was what 20 years had made of it. Up in the high chamber, away from the noise, Penelope worked at her loom by lamplight, and what she did there was the last war still being fought in that house. She had told them she would choose. That was the trap she had laid, 3 years gone, and she had lived inside it ever since. She had told them, with her eyes lowered and her voice pitched to sound like a woman finally bending, that it would shame her before every woman of the islands to let her husband's father go into the ground without a proper shroud. What kind of bride could she be? What luck would she carry to a new husband if old Laertes lay rotting in a winding sheet she had been too busy with her wedding to weave? Let her finish the shroud, she said. Let her do this one last duty to the house that had taken her in as a girl. Then she would name a man. They agreed. It sounded like surrender, and men who are certain they have already won will grant a small thing to feel generous. So by day she wove. She sat in the high chamber with her women around her and worked the great web back and forth, the shuttle flying, the pattern climbing under her hands. Fine work, the finest, a shroud fit for the father of a king. The suitors watched it lengthen. They were pleased. The thing was nearly done. And every night, when the house had drunk itself stupid and the lamps burned low, she locked the chamber door and picked it apart. She knelt over her own day's labor and found the threads with her fingers in the half-dark and drew them out one by one, unmaking the pattern until the web was exactly as long as it had been that morning, and her hands had cramped into claws and her knees had gone numb against the cold floor. Then she slept a little. Then the sun came up and she wove it again. "3 years of that. 1,000 nights of making a thing in the daylight so that she might destroy it in the dark, because the one power left to her was the power to keep a promise from ever coming true. It had aged her in places no mirror could show. She did not weep where they could see. A weeping woman was a woman close to giving in, and the moment they smelled it they would press. So she kept her face calm as the sea on a windless day, and she let them think what they liked. Her son did not have her gift for stillness. Telemachus was 20 years old, and he had spent every one of those years in a house full of men who treated him as a piece of furniture they would one day inherit along with the rest. He had been an infant at his mother's breast when his father sailed for the war in the East, too small to keep a single memory of the man's face. And so the father he owned was a father built of stories, the cleverest of all the kings, the one who took Troy when 10 years of stronger men had failed, the man the gods themselves stopped to hear. It is a hard thing to be the son of a story. A living father can disappoint you and forgive you and grow old and ordinary. A story stays perfect. You measure yourself against it every morning, and every morning you come up short. He walked through his own hall, and the suitors did not lift their eyes from their cups. That was the part that lived under his ribs like a splinter. They feasted at his table, in his seat, on his herds, and they did not fear him enough to look up. He was a boy to them, a problem for some later year, and there was no hurry, because boys grow into the shape of the world that raises them, and the world raising Telemachus had taught him, slowly and thoroughly, that he could do nothing at all. He had thought about killing them. He thought about it as a starving man thinks about a feast behind a locked door. There were 100 of them and one of him, and the moment he drew a blade in that hall, he would be a corpse cooling on the rushes before his mother heard the noise. Then there would be no one left between Penelope and the men who wanted her. The kingdom would be carved up, the old hound would die in the dirt, and the story of the house of Odysseus would end as most stories end. It would simply stop being told. So he did not draw the blade. He carried the wanting instead, and it soured in him, and he was becoming the kind of young man whose anger has nowhere to go, and so turns inward and eats him from the center out. On the night this tale begins, he sat apart at the low end of the hall and watched a man named Antinous call for more wine. Antinous was the worst of them and the handsomest, the one whose cruelty came with the easy grace of a man who has never once been told no, and he called for that wine as a lord calls for it in his own house. The old useless heat rose in Telemachus's throat. He looked toward the door, as he always looked toward the door, and he let himself think the one thought he had carried since he was small and had never spoken aloud to a living soul. That a ship would come into the harbor below, that a man would climb the goat track in the dusk, that the old hound would lift his ruined head and know him. It was a child's hope, and he was ashamed of it, and he could not kill it however hard he tried. Somewhere past the edge of every map the islanders knew, past the wine-dark water where the war had been and the longer dark beyond it, the question that haunted the whole rotting house was either a yes or a no, and no one living could say which. Was the king dead? Or was he only late? The fires burned, the wine ran out across the unscrubbed floor, and far away, on an island no Ithacan had ever named, in a hall on a hilltop much like this one, the gods had begun, at long last, to argue about the answer. Far from Ithaca, on the high seat above the clouds, where the immortals kept their long quarrels, the matter of Odysseus came up again over the wine. Athena would not let it rest. She had carried the grievance in her chest for 10 years and more, and she chose her moment well, when her father was easy with food and the rest of them were half listening. She reminded them of the man marooned at the edge of the world, kept on an island by a goddess who loved him and would not free him, a king with a wife and a son, and a whole country going to rot for the want of him, while the gods, who owed him a kindness, forgot his name. Her father heard her out. He had no taste for the business, since the Lord of the Sea nursed a hatred for Odysseus that ran deep and old, and no god cared to cross another over the head of a single mortal. Yet the man had been faithful in his day, and the years of his suffering had grown long enough to satisfy even an angry sea. So a bargain took shape at that table, one favor weighed against another, the mortal in question never once consulted. Hermes would go to the island and command the goddess to release her prisoner and let him build a raft and sail. Athena herself would go down to Ithaca and put iron into the spine of the boy. She did not wait for the cups to be cleared. She bound her sandals, took up the great spear that could break the ranks of fighting men, and stepped off the edge of heaven toward the sea. She came to earth at the gate of the house wearing the body of a man, a sea trader named Mentes, a friend of the family from the old days when such friendships still meant something. What she found waiting inside turned even an immortal stomach. The suitors lay sprawled across the hall on the hides of cattle they had slaughtered for their own amusement, throwing dice and bawling for more wine while the servants ran themselves ragged carrying it. And over the whole stinking riot, a blind singer had been set to sing of dead heroes, as though this were still a house that honored any. Telemachus saw the stranger first, and the sight of a guest left standing at the door while that rabble drank shamed him to the bone. He crossed the hall quickly, took the visitor by the right hand, lifted the spear, and stood it in the rack beside the spears of a man who had not come home to claim them, and he led the stranger to a chair set apart from the noise, where the two of them might hear each other speak. Food was brought, and water for the hands, and the courtesies a good house owed a guest were paid in full, even in a house gone to ruin. Only when the visitor had eaten did the boy lean close and speak low, so the drinkers would not catch the shape of his shame. He told the stranger whose hall this was, and whose chair stood empty, and what the men in it were doing to a kingdom while its master rotted somewhere in an unmarked sea. The words poured out of him, because no one had asked him a kind question in longer than he could remember, and grief that has been swallowed for years will come up fast the moment a door is opened. The stranger listened, and the grey eyes never left his face. When the boy had finished, the visitor spoke of having known Odysseus, of ties between their houses older than the war, and then said the thing that stopped the breath in the young man's throat. His father was not dead. He lived, held somewhere across the water against his will, and the sea that kept him was wide but not without an end, and no chain ever forged could hold such a man forever from his own door. Then the visitor said the harder thing, the thing the boy had needed to hear and had no one to say. A man could not sit in the wreck of his house waiting to be rescued and go on calling himself the son of a king. There were things a son could do. He could stand up in the daylight before the gathered men of the island and name the suitors for the thieves they were, in front of everyone whose good opinion they pretended to court. He could take a ship and go and find the truth of his father with his own two hands, sailing first to sandy Pylos where old Nestor still lived in honor, and on afterward to Sparta, where Menelaus had come home from the war carrying more knowledge of the scattered kings than any man left alive. Something moved in the boy that had not been there an hour before. It was not courage, for courage was a thing he had yet to earn the hard way, but it was the green start of it, the first knot of a spine beginning to set. He pressed the stranger to stay, to take a gift, to be honored as a guest should. The visitor refused all of it gently, rose, and went out, and the boy followed to the threshold to watch the figure cross the yard. Then the stranger was gone. Not down the road and not into the crowd, simply gone, the air closing quietly over the place where a man had stood, and a single bird climbed out of the empty courtyard into the evening and was lost against the darkening sky. Telemachus stood a long while looking at the bare ground. He understood then what manner of guest had sat at his table, and the understanding burned the last of the doubt out of him. In the morning he did a thing the island had not seen in 20 years. He sent the criers out at first light to summon the men of Ithaca to assembly, and when they had gathered in the old meeting ground, muttering and wondering what boy or fool had called them from their work, he walked in among the elders, took up the staff that had been his dead grandfather's, and stood to speak. What came out of him was rough and shook in places, yet it was true, and truth spoken aloud in a public place carries a weight that private grumbling never has. He laid it all before them, the 100 men who had fastened on his house and would not be shaken loose, the herds butchered, the cellars drained, his mother besieged beneath her own roof, and not one man on the island his father had ruled so gently willing to lift a hand against it. He asked them whether they felt no shame. He asked what they imagined his father would do to every one of them if he came back through that gate tomorrow and saw what they had allowed. Antinous answered, and there was no shame in him at all. He turned the blame onto Penelope, onto her years of holding the suitors off with promises she never meant to keep, onto the trick of the unravelled shroud that they had only lately uncovered, and he told the boy to send his mother home to her own father to be married off as the old man saw fit. Until she chose a husband, the men would eat in that hall every day, and the boy could learn to live with it. The assembly studied their own feet. Not one of them rose, because Antinous and his friends came from the strongest houses on every island near, and a man who made enemies of them tended to wake and find his barns alight. So the gathering came to nothing, which the suitors had known it would, and they went back to the hall laughing, to drink the day away. But the boy had not spoken to win the crowd. He had spoken to draw the line, to set down before gods and men exactly where he stood, and that much he had done. That night, with the help of the stranger who now wore the steady face of an old family servant named Mentor, he had a fast ship made ready in secret, water and barley carried down to the shore in the dark, and a crew of willing young men of the island gathered at the oars. He told his mother nothing, for she would have wept and begged him to stay, and he had only just found the hardness to go. They put out from Ithaca under the first stars with a wind the goddess herself had sent down to them, and the dark water hissed along the hull through the whole of that night. The boy, who had never once in his life left the island, sat in the stern and watched the only home he knew sink slowly behind the black line of the sea, and he found that he did not weep, and the discovery surprised him. They came to Pylos and found old Nestor on the beach in the middle of a great sacrifice, the eldest of all the kings who had gone to the war and the only one to have come home easily and grown old in peace among his sons. The old man welcomed the strangers before he even knew their names, fed them, and only afterward asked their errand, which was the right order of things in a decent house. When he learned whose son had come to his fire, he wept for love of the father, and then he talked. He talked of the war until the flames burned low, of the bitter quarrels of the kings and the worse scattering after Troy fell, when the gods turned against the victors for their pride, of Odysseus himself, of where he was, or whether he still drew breath. The old man could tell them nothing. He had lost sight of him on the water years ago and heard no certain word since. What Nestor gave instead was kindness and a road onward. At dawn he sent the boy overland towards Sparta, sent his own son along for company, and gave them a chariot and a team of horses to carry them, so that Telemachus might put his question to Menelaus, who of all the homecoming kings had wandered farthest and seen the most before he found his way back. The two young men drove a day and a night across the plains and came down at last into the deep valley of Sparta. They reached the house of Menelaus on the evening of a wedding feast, and in all their lives they had seen nothing to match it. The hall blazed with bronze and gold and amber and ivory, the plunder of a man who had broken a city and dragged its wealth home across the sea. And for a moment the boy from the poor stony island forgot why he had come and only stared. Menelaus took the two travellers in, had them bathed and fed, and asked them no questions until the meal was done. The same ancient law of the guest that held in every good house, from one end of the world to the other. But grief sat at that rich table beside the gold. Menelaus spoke of the brother he had lost, of the friends buried under the walls of Troy for the sake of a runaway wife, and of one man above all the rest whose fate still gnawed at him, a man whose equal he had never known for cunning or for heart, who had simply vanished off the earth and left a wife and a child to mourn a king who might be living or might be bones on some far shore. At the name of that man, the boy across the table could not hold back the tears, and he lifted his cloak to hide his face. The hiding did no good, for at that moment the lady of the house came down into the hall. Helen came, the most beautiful woman the world had ever made, and the most ruinous, the face that 1,000 ships had carried into war, and that 10 years of dead men had paid for, older now and no less lovely, and her beauty had become a kind of wound she carried into every room, a thing the whole table had silently agreed never to name. She looked once at the weeping boy and named his father on sight, for the likeness lay plain upon him, and the hall fell still. What followed was the very thing the boy had crossed the sea to find. Menelaus told them how, becalmed and starving on his own long road home, he had ambushed an old god of the sea on a bright Egyptian beach, and held the shifting creature fast through every shape it tried, until it surrendered the truth it had been hiding. From that ancient and unwilling mouth he had learned the fates of the men who sailed from Troy, who had drowned, and who had been cut down crossing their own thresholds, and he had learned of Odysseus too. The god had seen him. He lived. He was held on an island far out in the loneliest reach of the sea, in the house of a goddess who would not let him go, and he had no ship and no companions, and no means in all the world to cross the water home, and he sat on her shore in the daylight and wept toward Ithaca until there were no tears left in him. So the boy had his answer, and it was the cruelest answer there is, the kind that gives you hope and steals away the means to act on it in the very same breath. His father lived. His father was a prisoner of the sea with no road home, and Ithaca lay weeks behind him, crowded with armed men who would not be glad to see him return, men who, even now, the boy did not yet know, had caught wind of his secret sailing and were fitting out a ship of their own, and choosing the narrow water he would have to pass on his way back, and quietly sharpening their knives to make certain the son never lived to grow into the kind of man his father had been. Far to the west, past every shore that Nestor or Menelaus or the boy himself could have named, the man they spoke of sat where he had sat for 7 long years, on a headland above a beach at the very edge of the world, watching the water. He did not know that his son had become a man and gone out searching for him. He did not know that high above the clouds his case had finally been heard and answered, or that even now a messenger of the gods was crossing the bright air toward his island, carrying an order that would unmake the prison he had worn so long. He knew only the sea in front of him, and the smoke of a fire behind him that was not his own hearth, and the particular grief of a man kept alive a great while against his own will. His name was Odysseus, and his story truly begins at the place where his hope had ended, and that is where we go next. At the far western edge of the water, past the last of the islands that any trader had ever named, lay a green place that no map remembered. A goddess named Calypso lived there alone, and for 7 years she had kept a man in her house who did not want to be kept. By every measure, the island was a kind of paradise. Springs of clear water ran down through meadows thick with violet and wild parsley. Vines heavy with dark grapes climbed across the mouth of her cave, and birds that hunted the open sea roosted in the great trees that scented the whole island when the wind moved through them. Any god who chanced to pass that way would have stopped and looked and counted the man fortunate. The man himself spent his days sitting on the rocks above the beach, with his back turned to all of it, staring out across the water that would not let him cross, and weeping until there was nothing left in him, and the life ran out of him by slow degrees. At night, he went into the cave because she wished it, and he lay beside a goddess who loved him in a bed he had not chosen, and he gave her what she wanted. For a mortal who refuses an immortal learns quickly how little his refusal weighs. She was kind to him in her own fashion. She fed him food fit for the gods, and sang in a voice no living woman could match. And more than once she offered him a thing no man before him had ever been offered. She would make him deathless. She would draw the age out of him and the death that waited at the end of his road, and keep him young forever on her island, her companion until the last of the stars burned out. He refused her, and he refused her again each time she put it to him, sitting at her table over food that could have made him a god, and the refusal was the strangest stubbornness she had ever met in anything mortal. He did not want to live forever. He wanted to grow old and die in a poor, stony country at the other end of the world, beside a wife who was aging already and would be well into her years before he ever reached her, if he reached her at all. The goddess could not make sense of it. She would never age and never end, and her beauty was past any describing. And even so, he turned all of it aside for the memory of one mortal woman and a house on a rock. Into this long stalemate, on a bright morning, came a messenger from the gods. Hermes crossed the wide air on his golden sandals, came down at the island, and walked into the cave where Calypso sat at her loom, weaving and singing. And even a god so well-travelled paused a moment at the beauty of the place. The two immortals knew each other of old, and she fed him and seated him before she asked his errand, for the laws of the table held even among the deathless. Then she asked, and he gave it to her plainly, having no liking for the message and wanting it said and gone. The Lord of the gods had spoken, and his word left no room in it for argument. She was to release the mortal she held. The man was not fated to die on her island far from his own people, for his lot had always been to look upon his home once more and stand again in his own hall, and so she would let him build himself a raft, put him out on the water, and trouble him no further. Calypso heard the whole of it, and a tremor went through her that had nothing of the divine in it. She turned on the messenger and charged the gods with cruelty and jealousy together. And she was not wrong in either count. They could not bear it, she said, when a goddess took a mortal man into her bed and loved him in the open. The male gods did as they pleased with mortal girls, and no one raised a word. But let a goddess find some comfort of her own, and the whole of heaven came down to spoil it. She had saved this man. She had found him half drowned and clinging to the keel of a shattered ship, the only soul left of all his company, and she had taken him in and fed him and cherished him and meant to keep him beyond the reach of death forever. Now she was ordered to give him back to the sea, and there was nothing in her, goddess or not, able to stand against the will of the highest of the gods. So she let him go, since she had no choice in it, but she did the thing with a goddess's pride intact. She would not carry the messenger's order to the man as though it were her own defeat. She went out herself to the headland where he sat in his usual grief, and she stood over him, and she told him that she was setting him free. He did not believe her at first. 7 years had taught him to hunt for the hook inside any kindness, and he suspected a trick of some kind, a scheme to coax him onto the open water in a flimsy raft and let the sea do quietly what she would not do with her own hands. He made her swear to it. He would not lay a single timber, he said, until she swore the great binding oath of the gods that she intended him no harm, and after a moment, half amused and half wounded, She swore it, and only then did he begin to trust her. That last evening she tried once more. Over the meal she asked whether he truly grasped what he was choosing, whether he understood that the woman he was killing himself to reach could not begin to match her, a goddess in face or in form, and that the road home would cost him more suffering than he could yet imagine. He answered her with care, being a man who knew the danger in wounding the proud. He granted all of it. His wife was mortal and would fade and die, and Calypso was deathless and lovely beyond any comparison. And still, every day of his life, he ached for home and for the day of his return. If a god wished to break him on the water again, he would bear that as well. He had borne a great deal already, and one more sorrow could find its place among the rest. In the morning she gave him a great axe fitted to his hands and an adze besides, and she led him to a stand of tall trees at the edge of the island, where the timber had long since seasoned dry. He felled 20 of them and trimmed them and squared them true, bored the holes and fitted the joints and pinned them fast, laid a deck and raised a mast and hung a sail the goddess wove for him, and he made the whole craft broad and deep and strong, big enough to carry a load of cargo across open water. It took him 4 days. On the 5th she bathed him and dressed him in clothes that carried the scent of her island, and sent him down to the shore with wine and bread and a skin of sweet water, and she called up a warm and steady wind to bear him out. She watched from the rocks until the sail was a white fleck on the sea, and then was nothing at all. And then she turned and went back up alone into her empty cave. For 17 days he sailed and did not sleep. He kept the steering oar in his hands the whole of every night, and held his course by the stars, by the great bear that wheels in the north and never sinks under the sea, keeping her always on his left hand as the goddess had instructed him, and the wind held fair and the water stayed gentle, and for 17 days it seemed the gods had finished with him at last. On the 18th day, the dim shape of land rose ahead of him at the rim of the sea, a coast of low hills, the first solid ground he had laid eyes on in 7 years, and he had drawn close enough now that something rose in him he had not felt in longer than he could remember. But the Lord of the Sea was coming home across the sky from the far country of the Ethiopians, where he had been feasting, and from a great distance he caught sight of the small raft and the man riding it in toward the shore. His old hatred woke in him on the instant. He understood that the gods had settled the man's fate among themselves while he was away from the table, and it was too late now to undo their decree. Yet nothing stopped him from making the last stretch of water a torment the man would carry through whatever life he had left. He took up his great trident, gathered the clouds, and stirred the whole sea up from its floor with a single stroke. Every wind tore loose at once, the east and the south and the wild west hurling against one another, and the day went black as deepest night, and a wave reared over the little raft higher than any the man had seen on the water in all his years of sailing. He knew then that he was going to die, and he said aloud to himself that the men who fell at Troy in the fighting had been the lucky ones, with friends around them and a barrow raised over their bones, while he was to be drowned in the dark with no living soul ever to know. The wave came down and buried him. It wrenched the steering oar out of his grip, snapped the mast across, flung the sail and the spar far out into the water, and the man himself went down deep under the weight of it and stayed under a long while, dragged by the sodden clothes the goddess had given him, before he clawed his way back up and broke the surface, coughing the brine out of his chest. He caught the wreck as it wallowed past and hauled himself onto it and rode the bare timbers wherever the storm threw them, and the warring winds tossed the broken thing back and forth between them in their sport. A sea goddess saw him there. She had once been a mortal woman, a king's daughter who had suffered greatly and been taken up into the salt water and granted a place among its powers, and the sight of a drowning man stirred the pity her old life had left behind in her. She rose beside the wreck in the body of a seabird, settled on the timbers, and spoke to him. He must give up the raft, she said, for it would not outlast the storm. He must strip off the heavy clothes Calypso had given him, which were dragging him down, trust himself to the water, and bind her veil about his chest, an immortal thing that would not let him drown, and swim for the distant shore. The moment his hands found land, he must throw the veil back into the sea and turn his face away as he did it, and she would have it again. She put the veil in his hands and slipped back down into the depths and was gone beneath a wave. He did not trust her. A lifetime of traps had taught him that a god offering help on the open sea was the very thing a drowning man ought to fear, and his first thought was that this was a fresh scheme to lure him off the one solid thing he still had beneath him. He decided to keep to the timbers while they held together, and only when there was nothing left of them would he do the rest. He had barely finished the thought when a second wave fell on him and broke the raft to pieces and scattered the logs across the water, and he was left clinging to a single beam, sitting astride it as it was flung along, and there was no longer any choice left to make. So he stripped off the goddess's clothes, bound the veil around his chest, let go of the beam, threw himself out into the water, and swam. The Lord of the Sea watched him go and shook his head and told him to thrash about in his misery now until he washed up among other men, and even then he would not find his suffering at an end. And with that he drove his horses away across the water toward his own deep house and left him. Then another of the gods took a hand. Athena stilled the run of the other winds and held them quiet, and roused a strong, steady gale out of the north to flatten the swell ahead of the swimmer and drive him on toward the land. And so between one god's malice and another's care, the man was kept alive on the water for 2 days and 2 nights, and in all that time he never once saw a way that he would live. On the 3rd morning, when the wind had fallen and the sea lay quiet for a moment, he lifted his head on the crest of a swell and saw land close at hand, a true coast with trees on it, near enough almost to touch. The sight filled him with a joy he had no words for, the joy of a man who has given himself up for dead and finds, against everything, that he is going to live. He swam for it with the last of the strength left in him, but the coast that had looked like deliverance turned cruel as he drew near it. There was no easy beach, only a wall of cliff and reef with the great swells bursting white against the stone, and he understood that if he let the sea carry him straight in, it would dash him on the rocks and break him to nothing. He trod water beyond the surf and made himself think, even now, even worn past the edge of reason, for thinking had always been the thing that saved him when his strength could not. A great wave caught him before he was ready and hurled him in against the rocks, and he seized the stone as he struck it and held on, and the backwash tore him loose and dragged him out again, and the skin of his hands was left behind on the rock where he had gripped it. Athena set a thought in his mind. He swam along outside the breakers, searching the shore, until he came to the mouth of a river running quietly down into the sea, and there the water lay calm, and the bank was low and free of stone. He prayed to the god of the river, whoever the god might be, to take pity on a man with no name and no country left to him, and the river heard and stilled its current and held back its flow and carried him gently into the land. He crawled out of the water on his hands and knees. His whole body had swollen with the sea, and the brine ran in streams from his mouth and his nose, and he had no breath and no voice and no strength at all, and he lay where he had come ashore as a thing already dead. When a little life crept back into him, he understood that he could not stay where he was. Night was coming on, and the air off the river ran cold, and a man left naked and wet in the open would not live to see the morning. He dragged himself up the bank to a place where 2 olive bushes had grown together, one wild and one grafted, so thick that no wind got through them, and no sun and no rain. And he crawled in under them and raked together a deep bed of the dead leaves that lay everywhere on the ground. He buried himself in the leaves until he was covered over and warm, a man hiding the last live coal of himself against the dark. And Athena closed his eyes and laid a deep sleep on him, so that he would have the strength for whatever the shore held in the morning. He did not know what country he had washed up in, or whose hands he had put himself into, or whether the people of it would take in a stranger, or cut him down where he stood. But that question belonged to the daylight, and the daylight was still a long way off. While the man lay buried in his bed of leaves, Athena went up into the town that stood on the hill above the harbour, into the palace of the king who ruled there, and to the room where the king's young daughter slept. The people of that country were called the Phaeacians, a seafaring folk who lived far from other men and kept ships that were said to need no steering and to know the way to any shore on their own. The girl was a princess named Nausicaa, unmarried and not long out of childhood, and the goddess bent over her in a dream wearing the face of a friend and put a thought in her head about laundry, about how a girl close to the age of marriage ought to see to the washing of the household linen, and how a trip down to the river in the morning would be a fine and pleasant thing. In the morning, the girl asked her father for a wagon and a team of mules, and she and her maids loaded the dirty linen and drove down to the washing pools at the mouth of the river, not far from where the stranger lay sleeping. They trod the clothes clean in the water and spread them along the shore to dry, and they bathed and ate, and afterward they fell to throwing a ball among themselves and singing, careless and laughing, with no one near to watch them. A throw went wide and the ball splashed into the deep of the river, and the girls all cried out at once, and the sound of it carried up the bank into the thicket and woke the man. He came up out of his deep sleep, not knowing where he was, and he lay still a moment and heard women's voices close by. Naked, crusted with brine, his body scored and swollen from his days in the sea, he understood that he had no choice but to show himself to whoever they were, since they were his only hope of food and shelter and a road home, and he understood just as clearly what the sight of him would do to a band of young women alone by a river. He broke a leafy branch from the bushes to hold in front of himself, and he came out of the trees. The maids took one look at the thing that lurched out at them, crusted and wild and dripping, and they scattered screaming along the shore in every direction. Only the princess held her ground. Athena had put courage in her, and she stood where she was and waited, while the stranger, keeping a careful distance, began to speak. He did not rush at her and throw his arms about her knees in supplication, judging that to lay hands on her would only frighten her the worse. He stood off and spoke, and he chose every word. He said he could not tell whether she was a goddess or a mortal girl, and that if she was mortal, then her parents and her brothers were blessed beyond other people, and most blessed of all would be the man who one day won her for his wife. He said he had been many days at the mercy of the sea and was cast up on this shore knowing not a soul, and he begged her, as the one person who had not run from him, for a rag to cover himself and the road to the nearest town. The words were well chosen, and they reached her. She answered that he seemed neither a fool nor a wicked man, and that strangers and beggars came under the protection of the gods, and a gift to such people, however small, was a gift well given. She called her frightened maids back and shamed them for running, and she had them set food and drink before him and bring him oil and clothing, and she sent him off down the bank to wash himself out of their sight. He scrubbed the salt and the filth of the sea off his body, and worked the oil into his cracked skin, and put on the clothes they had brought. And Athena laid a change over him, making him taller to the eye, and his shoulders broader, and his hair come curling thick and dark about his head, so that when he walked back up the bank and sat apart on the sand, the princess hardly knew him for the same wretch. She said low to her maids that a moment ago she had thought him hideous, and now he seemed almost one of the gods, and that she could wish for a husband of his kind, but she said it only to them and not to him. She would not bring him into the town at her own side, though, and she told him plainly why. The Phaeacians were a proud people and quick to gossip, and if the rough men of the harbour saw their princess walking home beside a tall stranger, they would say things about her she did not care to have said. He should follow the wagon at a distance as far as the edge of the town, she said, and wait in a poplar grove there, and come in alone after, and ask the way to her father's house. When he reached the palace, he was to walk straight past her father and go to her mother, the queen, and lay his hands on the queen's knees in supplication. For if the queen looked kindly on him, then his passage home was as good as won, whatever any man in that hall might think of it. He did exactly as she said. He waited in the grove until the time was right, and then he went into the town through the dusk with the goddess wrapping him in a mist so that no one stopped or questioned him. And he came at last to the palace, a house of bronze walls and golden doors with gardens where fruit hung ripe in every season. And he walked the whole length of the hall through all the seated lords and knelt and put his arms around the knees of the queen. A hush fell over the company at the sight of him. Then an old lord spoke up and said it shamed them all to leave a suppliant kneeling in the ashes of the hearth. And the king raised the stranger up and seated him in a place of honor and called for food and wine, and gave his word that in the morning the matter of the man's passage home would go before the council. In the days that followed, they treated him as an honored guest and did not press him for his name, which was the old courtesy among decent people. They held games for him and feasted him, and on one of those evenings the king called for his singer. The man was blind, and the gods had taken his eyes and given him the gift of song in their place, and he was the finest singer in all that country. At the king's word he took up his lyre and sang of the war at Troy, and of a bitter quarrel that had once flared there between Odysseus and the greatest of the fighting men. And the lords of the hall leaned in and loved it, for to them it was a grand old tale of famous men long dead and far away. But the stranger in the place of honor drew his cloak up over his head and wept behind it. None of the lords saw, for the song held them fast, and when the singing paused, he wiped his face and let the cloak fall, and was himself again. And when it started up once more, he covered his head and wept again. Only the king, seated close beside him, marked what he did and said nothing of it then, but kept the watching to himself. Later, when the wine had gone round and the hall had grown easy, the king pressed the singer for one more song, and asked him to sing of the wooden horse and the fall of Troy. The blind man sang of the great hollow horse left standing on the empty beach, and of the picked men hidden away in its belly, and of the city going up in fire in the dark. And now the stranger wept so openly that there was no hiding it any longer. The king marked it past all doubt this time. He stopped the song and turned to his guest before the whole company and asked him the thing that courtesy had let them leave alone for 3 days. Who was he? Where did he come from? And why should the fall of a far city break a grown man at a feast as though he had buried his own brothers beneath its walls? For a moment, the stranger sat with the question hanging over him. Then he drew his hand down over his face and lifted his head and gave them the answer they had waited for. He was Odysseus, son of Laertes, the man whose tricks were spoken of wherever men told stories, and his home was the island of Ithaca, and he had been trying to reach it for 10 long years. The name went round the hall in a murmur, for every one of them had heard it, and now the man who had broken Troy sat eating bread at their table. They begged him for the whole of it, and he did not refuse them. He set down his cup and began at the beginning, with the day the war ended and the ships turned for home. And he told them everything that had happened to him in the 10 years since the towers of Troy came down. He began with the leaving of Troy. 12 ships had gone out with him when the war was won, every one of them crowded with his own men of Ithaca. And the first land the wind carried them to was the country of the Cicones, a people who had fought on the losing side of the war. They came ashore and took the town. They killed the men who stood against them and shared out the women and the plunder among the crews, and the whole thing was too easy, and that was the danger in it. Odysseus told his men to take what they had won and be back at the ships before the day was out, but they would not hear him. There was wine in that town and sheep along the shore and good meat for roasting, and men who have been 10 years at war see no reason to hurry away from any of it, and so they stayed on the beach and feasted into the night. While they feasted, the townsmen who had fled went inland to their kinsmen, harder fighters who lived up in the hills and were many, and these came down at first light in their hundreds. The fighting went against the Ithacans all that morning, and by the time they cut their way back to the ships and shoved off from the shore, they had left 6 men dead from every single crew. They put out grieving for the dead and counted it the worst day they had known, having no way yet to measure it against what was still ahead of them. A storm caught them as they rounded the last cape of the charted world and drove them south for 9 days over open water, far past any coast that a single man among them could name. On the 10th day they raised a low green shore and put in for water, and Odysseus sent 3 men inland to learn what people lived there. The 3 did not come back. He went after them and found them sitting among a mild and friendly people who had given them a fruit to eat, the fruit of the lotus, and not one of the 3 had any wish to leave. Whoever ate that fruit lost all desire for anything beyond it. He forgot his home and his people and the long road he had been traveling, and he wanted only to stay among the lotus eaters and eat and forget, and he wept when he was forced away from it. Odysseus dragged the 3 men back to the ships by main force, lashed them down under the rowing benches, and let no one else go near the stuff, and he gave the word to pull hard for open water before the country could swallow any more of his crew. The next land they found was a wild and lonely country that belonged to the Cyclopes, a race of giants who knew nothing of farming or of ships or of law, who sowed no crops and held no councils, and lived each one apart in his own cave on the mountainside, caring nothing for his neighbors and nothing for the gods. The Ithacans landed first on a wooded island just offshore, thick with wild goats, and they hunted and ate well, and across a narrow strait they could see the smoke of the giants' fires and hear their deep voices and the bleating of their flocks. In the morning Odysseus took his own ship and crew across the strait, for he wanted to see for himself what manner of creatures these were, and whether they would offer a stranger the gifts that a host owes a guest. He chose out 12 of his best men to climb up with him and left the others to mind the ship. And he carried along a goat skin of dark, strong wine that a priest had once given him, wine so powerful that a man cut it with 20 parts of water before he drank, and he brought it on an instinct he could not have named. They came to a great cave near the shore, hung about with laurel, with pens of lambs and kids outside and racks of drying cheese within and pails standing full of milk and whey, and the giant who owned it was away with his flock. The men wanted to snatch the cheeses and drive off some of the lambs and run for the ship while the cave stood empty. Odysseus would not allow it. He meant to see the owner and take a gift from his hand, and that wanting cost him more than he could have guessed. The giant came home at evening, driving his flock before him, a thing the size of a mountain crag with a single great eye set in the middle of his forehead, and he flung down a load of firewood with a crash that sent the Ithacans scrambling into the dark corners of the cave. He drove the ewes inside to be milked and left the rams in the yard, and then he lifted a boulder so huge that 20 wagons could not have dragged it and set it in the mouth of the cave to seal the entrance. There was no moving that stone by any strength the men had. They were shut inside with him, and they knew it, and they pressed back against the walls and watched him in the light of his fire. He lit the fire and saw them, and he asked who they were, traders or pirates roving the sea, and his voice came down on them so deep and so vast that it broke the courage in them. Odysseus answered for the company. He said they were Greeks driven off course on the way home from the war at Troy, and he asked, in the proper words, for the welcome that Zeus grants to strangers and suppliants the world over. The giant only laughed. He said the Cyclopes cared nothing for Zeus and nothing for any god, being stronger than the lot of them, and that he would do with his guests whatever he pleased. What he did then, he did slowly and without alarm. He reached out and caught up 2 of the men by the feet and dashed their heads against the floor until the brains ran out on the stone, and he tore them limb from limb and ate them raw, flesh and bone together, while the rest looked on and wept and prayed and could do nothing at all. Then he drank down a great mass of milk and stretched out among his sheep and slept. Odysseus' first thought was to draw his sword and drive it into the sleeping giant's chest, and his hand was on the hilt before a second thought stopped it. If he killed the giant, they would die regardless, sealed in behind a stone that no 12 men could shift, and they would starve in the dark beside the corpse. So he held his hand and waited out the night and turned the problem over, and by morning he had the shape of a plan. In the morning the giant breakfasted on 2 more of the men in the same fashion, then rolled the stone back, drove his flock out, and rolled it shut again behind him, sealing the rest of them in, and went off up the mountain after his sheep without a care. Alone in the cave, Odysseus set to work. A great green staff of olive wood lay by the pens, the size of a ship's mast, and he cut a length from it and had his men sharpen one end to a point and harden the point in the embers, and they hid it away under the muck on the floor. They drew lots for who would help him drive it home, and the lots gave him the 4 men he would have chosen himself. That evening the giant brought his flock in, closed the cave, and ate 2 more of the company for his supper. When he had done, Odysseus came forward with a bowl of the dark wine and offered it to him, telling him to wash down his meal of human flesh. The giant drank, and the wine was stronger and sweeter than anything that had ever passed his lips, and he called for more. And Odysseus filled the bowl a second time and a third, and the strong unwatered wine went up into the giant's head and made him easy. He asked the stranger his name and promised him a gift in return for the drink. Odysseus told him his name was Nobody, that this was what his mother and father and all his friends had always called him, Nobody, and the giant grinned and named his gift. He would eat nobody last of all the company, after the rest were gone, and that, he said, was the gift a guest could look to get from him. Then the wine took him all the way under, and he rolled over onto his side in a dead drunken sleep, his head lolling, bringing up wine and gobbets of the men he had eaten. Odysseus drove the stake deep into the embers until the green wood glowed and was on the point of catching, and then he and his 4 men lifted it and rammed the burning point straight into the giant's single eye and threw their weight on it and turned it like a drill, and the eye hissed and burst around the wood, and the giant woke with a scream, wrenched the stake out, hurled it away, and clawed at his ruined face, blind now and roaring loud enough to shake the mountain. The other Cyclopes heard him and came down from their caves in the dark and stood outside the great stone and called into him, asking what ailed him, whether some man was driving off his flocks or murdering him. And the blinded giant shouted back the very answer the trick had been built to draw out of him. "Nobody," he cried. "Nobody is killing me. Nobody is murdering me by cunning and not by force." The giants outside heard that and grumbled that if nobody was harming him, then the pain must be sent from the gods, and there was nothing they could do about it. And they told him to pray to his father, and they went back to their beds and left him to his agony. Inside, Odysseus laughed quietly to himself to see how cleanly the name and the plan had taken them all. But they were still shut in the cave. The giant heaved the stone away from the entrance and sat himself down in the gap with his arms spread wide, groping to catch any man who tried to slip out among the sheep, certain the stranger was too simple to get past him. Odysseus was not too simple. He took the big, thick rams, the best of the flock, and bound them together in threes with twigs of willow. And beneath the belly of each middle ram he tied one of his men, buried in the deep wool, and for himself he chose the greatest ram of all and gripped the fleece underneath it and hung there facing up. When the dawn came and the flock crowded out to pasture, the giant ran his hands over the back of every animal that passed and felt nothing beneath them, and so one by one his prisoners rode out between his fingers and were free of the cave. They drove the rams down to the ship, got them aboard, and pulled away from that shore as hard as the oars could carry them, and they had got clean away. If Odysseus had held his tongue, they would have stayed away. But once they were a little out from the land, he could not stop himself, and he stood up and shouted back across the water, jeering at the giant, telling him this was the price for eating men who had come to his cave as guests. The giant heard where the voice came from, tore the brow off a hill, and flung it out to sea. It fell just ahead of the ship and threw up a wave that carried the whole vessel back in toward the land, and the men hauled at the oars in a frenzy to drag clear of the shore again, and they begged their captain to hold his peace before the next throw drowned them all. He would not. The pride was up in him now, and he had to make the giant know whose hand had done this to him. And so he called out his own name across the water, his true name, that it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home was Ithaca, who had put out his eye. That was the thing the giant had been waiting to hear. He lifted his blind face to the sky and called on his father, for he was a son of the Lord of the sea, and he prayed with his whole ruined heart that Odysseus, son of Laertes, might never come home to Ithaca, or, if he was fated to come home, if the gods had already written that he must, then let him come late and come broken. Let him come with every one of his men dead behind him. Let him come on a stranger's ship, and let him find his own house full of grief and trouble when he got there. The Lord of the sea heard his son, and he granted the prayer, word for word. They rowed on to the island where the rest of the fleet lay waiting, and they divided the giant's sheep among the crews, and they made their sacrifice and feasted that night, and mourned the men left dead in the cave, telling it now to the hushed hall of the Phaeacians. Odysseus did not pretend he had not earned what followed. He had blinded the giant by his wits, and saved most of his crew by his wits, and then thrown the whole of it away for the joy of hearing his own name spoken in fear. And the sea had been set against him from that day to the one that washed him up on their shore. There was a great deal left to tell, and the worst of it was still to come, and the hall leaned closer to hear. The next island they came to floated free upon the sea, ringed all the way round with a wall of unbroken bronze, and on it lived Aeolus, the man the gods had set in charge of all the winds. He kept them shut up and loosed them as he pleased, and he lived in great ease with his wife and his 6 sons and 6 daughters, who had married one another and feasted together every day of their lives. He took the Ithacans in and kept them as his guests for a whole month, and he listened gladly to the tale of Troy. And when Odysseus asked at last for help on his road home, the Wind King was glad to give it. He took the hide of a great ox and bound into it all the winds that blow, every gale and storm and contrary blast, and he tied the bag shut with a cord of bright silver, so that not a breath could escape, and he stowed it deep in the hold of Odysseus's ship. Then he called up the one wind they needed, the gentle west wind, to blow steady at their backs and carry the fleet home. It was a kingly gift. For 9 days and 9 nights they ran before that wind, and Odysseus kept the steering oar in his own hands the whole of the time and trusted it to no one. And on the 10th day the hills of Ithaca came up out of the sea ahead of them. They were so close that they could see men moving on the shore tending their fires. With home in plain sight, Odysseus did the one human thing he had held off for 10 days. He had not slept once in all that time, and now, sure the danger was behind them, he let his eyes fall closed and dropped into a deep sleep at the steering oar. While he slept, The crew began to talk among themselves. They had watched their captain guard that ox, hide bag the whole voyage, and let no man near it. And they had worked themselves into the belief that it was stuffed with gold and silver, treasure the Wind King had given him as a parting gift, riches he meant to keep for himself while they came home to Ithaca with empty hands as they had left it. 10 years of resentment had been gathering in them, and now it broke loose. One of them said they ought to see for themselves what was in the bag before they made port, and the others were quick to agree, and they loosed the silver cord. Every wind that Aeolus had bound came shrieking out of the bag at once. The blast caught the ships and flung them back out to sea, away from the land, and the storm howled over them while Ithaca shrank and vanished behind the waves. Odysseus woke to find his home gone and his ship driven before a gale, and for a moment he thought of going over the side and ending it there in the water. He did not. He covered his head instead and lay still and let himself be carried, enduring, since a living man might yet find a way out, and a drowned one never could. The winds drove them all the way back to the floating island they had left behind, and they landed, and Odysseus climbed up to the bronze hall again to beg the Wind King for a second gift. But Aeolus would not hear of it. When he understood that the fleet had thrown his help away and come crawling back, he ordered Odysseus out of his house and told him to be gone, that he would give no aid to a man so plainly hated by the gods. There was nothing to be said against it. A man the immortals had set themselves against was a man no one cared to stand beside, and the doors of the bronze hall shut, and the Ithacans put back out to sea with no wind at all to help them. Now they had to row, and they rowed for 6 days and 6 nights without a breath of wind to spare their arms, and the labor of it broke something in them that the storms had not. On the 7th day they came to a strange harbor, a deep still pool almost wholly enclosed by tall cliffs, with a narrow mouth between 2 headlands and no swell at all inside it. It had the look of the safest anchorage in the world. One by one the other captains brought their ships in through the narrow mouth and moored them close together in the calm water. Odysseus did not. He held his own ship back outside the harbor mouth and made it fast to the rock at the very entrance, and then he climbed a height to look the country over. There was no smoke of farms and no ploughed land, only a track running down out of the hills, and he sent 3 men up it to learn who lived there. They met a girl drawing water at a spring, a giant of a girl, friendly enough, who told them her father was king of the place and pointed them toward his house. They went, and inside they found the queen, a creature of monstrous size, and the sight of her froze them where they stood. She bellowed for her husband, and he came, and he wanted no talk and no guest gift from them. He seized one of the 3 men to make his meal of on the spot, and the other 2 turned and ran for their lives back down toward the harbor. The king raised the cry as he came after them, and the Laestrygonians poured out of the hills, thousands of them, giants every one, and they lined the cliffs above that enclosed harbor where the ships lay penned in the still water with nowhere to go. What followed was butchery and not battle. The giants tore boulders loose from the cliffs, and rained them down on the trapped ships, smashing the hulls and the men inside them together. And where a man surfaced and tried to swim, they ran him through with their spears and strung him up to carry home and eat. There was no fighting back and no way to flee, for the harbour that had looked so safe was a stone trap with a single narrow door. 11 ships died in that pool with all their crews, and the screaming carried out across the water to the one ship still waiting at the mouth. Odysseus did not wait to see the end of it. He drew his sword and cut through the cable that held his ship to the rock and shouted to his crew to row for their lives. And they threw themselves at the oars in terror and shot out away from that murderous coast and did not slacken until the cliffs and the screaming were far behind them. His was the only ship of all the 12 that had sailed from Troy to come away from that harbour. The rest were gone, with every man aboard them, in the span of a single morning. They rode on heavy with grief, mourning the friends they had lost and glad in spite of themselves to be drawing breath. And after a time they came to another island, ran the ship up onto its beach, and lay there 2 days and 2 nights, worn down to nothing. They did not know whose island it was, nor that it belonged to a goddess, the most dangerous creature Odysseus would meet in all his wandering, a place where he would lose more men and more time than anywhere on earth, save the country of the dead itself. That was the next thing he had to tell, and the whole of the Phaeacians waited in silence to hear it. The island was called Aea, and they lay on its beach 2 days and 2 nights, too sick with grief and weariness to do anything but breathe. On the 3rd morning, Odysseus took his spear and climbed a rocky height to see what kind of place they had washed up in, and from the top he saw that the whole of it was forest, and in the middle of the forest, rising up through the trees, a thin column of smoke. Someone lived there. He thought about going to find out who, and then he thought better of marching his starved men up to a stranger's door with no plan, and he turned and came back down to the shore. On the way down, he came on a great stag walking to the river to drink, and he drove his spear clean through it and hauled the carcass up onto his shoulders and carried it back to the ship. And that night the crew ate roast venison and drank the last of their wine and slept soundly for the first time in days. In the morning he told them what he had seen, the forest and the smoke, and the men remembered the cave of the giant and the harbour of the man-eaters, and the heart went out of them, and some of them wept. But there was no living on that beach forever. He divided the company into 2 parties, took command of one, and gave the other to a man named Eurylochus, and they shook lots in a helmet to settle who would go up to the house in the woods. And the lot fell to Eurylochus and his 22 men. They found the house deep in the forest, built of dressed stone in a clearing, and around it prowled mountain wolves and lions that did not attack. The beasts came up to the men instead and fawned on them and pawed at them gently, and the men were more frightened by that than they would have been by an honest charge, for there is nothing right in a lion that wags and begs for a kind hand. These had all once been men, travellers the mistress of the house had drugged and changed, though the Ithacans did not know it yet. From inside the house came a woman's voice singing sweetly over the clack of a great loom, and one of the men called out, and the singing stopped. The door opened, and the lady of the house came out, lovely and gracious, and she smiled and asked them all in to eat. They went, every one of them but Eurylochus, who hung back outside, smelling a trap. She sat the others down and set before them a dish of cheese and barley and honey and wine, and into it she had stirred a drug to wipe away all memory of their own country. They ate. The moment they had eaten, she struck each of them across the shoulder with a wand and drove them squealing out into the pens beside the house, for they had become swine, with the bristled bodies and the snouts and the grunting of pigs, and only their minds were left them, human and aware, shut inside the animals and weeping. She threw them acorns to eat and left them there in the muck. Eurylochus waited a long while for the others to come out, and when they did not, he ran back through the forest to the ship, and at first he could not force out a single word, only stood and stared with the horror still on him. When his voice came back, he told them what he had seen, the woman, the house, the men who went in and never came out again. Odysseus took up his sword and slung his bow across his back and told Eurylochus to lead him to the place. The man caught him by the knees and begged him not to go, said he would lose them all and never see home, that they should put to sea that hour and leave the lost men for dead. Odysseus left him at the ship and went up into the forest alone. On the path through the woods, a young man met him, beautiful, with the first soft down of a beard, and it was the god Hermes in disguise, come to help him. The god told him plainly what waited at the house and how the men had been turned to pigs, and warned him he would go the same way himself if he walked in unarmed against the witch's craft. Then he pulled a plant up out of the ground, a herb with a black root and a milk-white flower, a thing the gods called moly that no mortal hand could easily dig, and he put it in Odysseus's hand and told him to keep it on him. With that herb in him, the drug would do nothing. When the witch struck at him with her wand and saw it fail, the god said he must draw his sword and rush at her as though he meant to kill her, and she would shrink away and offer to take him to her bed, and he must not refuse, for only she could free his men and undo the whole of it. But before he went with her, he must make her swear, the great oath of the gods, to do him no further harm, or she would strip the strength and the manhood out of him the moment he stood disarmed and naked before her. It went as the god had said it would. The witch, whose name was Circe, welcomed him in and seated him, and handed him the drugged cup, and he drank it dry and felt nothing at all. She tapped him with a wand and told him to get out to the sty with the rest, and he did not change. He drew his sword instead and sprang at her with a shout, and she screamed and dropped beneath the blade and caught him round the knees, crying that no man had ever drunk that cup and kept his shape, and that he could be no one but the man a god had foretold to her long ago, Odysseus, homeward bound from Troy. She offered him her bed. He took her at her word, but he made her swear the binding oath first, that she meant him no harm, and only when the oath was spoken did he go with her. Her women bathed him and dressed him and laid a fine meal before him, and he would not touch a bite of it. He sat with his eyes lowered and his mind far away, and when she asked what ailed him, he told her he could not eat or take any joy while his men were penned in her yard as beasts. So she rose and went out with her wand, and let the swine out of the sty, and worked a fresh salve over each of them, and the bristles dropped away, and they stood up men once more, younger and taller and finer to look at than they had been before. And they knew him and crowded round him weeping, and even the witch was moved at the sight. After that, the danger turned clean into its opposite. Circe proved as fine a host as she had been a deadly one, and she had Odysseus bring the rest of the crew up from the shore, over the protests of Eurylochus, who alone still feared her, and she kept them all in comfort in her house in the forest. There was meat without end, and sweet wine and soft beds, and the men who had been starved and hunted and bereaved sank down into the ease of it and lost all wish to leave. A full year slipped by in that house. They ate and drank and forgot, and the island held them as surely as the lotus had held the three men long before. And in the end it was the crew themselves who had to take Odysseus aside and remind him that there was such a place as home, and that they had once meant to reach it. He went to Circe and asked her to keep her word and send them on their way. She did not refuse him, but what she said next drove the blood out of his face. Before he could sail for Ithaca, he had one more voyage to make, a voyage no living man had ever made and come home from. He had to cross to the very edge of the world and go down into the house of the dead, and there call up the ghost of a blind prophet named Tiresias, the one soul in all that grey country who had kept his wits and his power of sight beyond death, and learn from that dead mouth the road home and what was waiting on it. When the crew heard where they were bound, they sat down where they stood and wept and tore at their hair and wished they had never been born, but there was no other road home, and all their weeping changed nothing at all. Before they could sail, there was a death, and it came in a foolish, ordinary way that made it harder to bear. The youngest of the crew was a man named Elpenor, no great fighter and no great thinker, who had drunk too much on the last night in Circe's house and gone up to sleep in the cool air on the flat roof. In the grey before dawn, hearing the others moving about below as they made ready, he started up all at once, forgot where he was, and stepped off the edge of the roof, and he fell and broke his neck, and his soul went down to the house of the dead. The others were so caught up in the work of leaving that not one of them marked that he was gone. Circe had told Odysseus the road, though he had not understood until now how dark a road it was. She sent a fair wind after the black ship, and they ran before it all that day with the sail spread wide, out across the great river that circles the edge of the world, until they came to a place where the light gave out. There a people called the Cimmerians lived in a country the sun never reaches, wrapped in cloud and fog from one end of the year to the other, in a night that has no morning. The Ithacans ran the ship up onto that lightless shore, and Odysseus took the 2 black sheep Circe had given him and went to the place she had named. with 2 of his men behind him, and there he did the things she had taught him. He dug a pit a forearm deep and a forearm across, and around it he poured offerings to all the dead, first milk and honey, then sweet wine, then water, and over the whole of it he scattered white barley. He prayed to the strengthless dead and promised them sacrifices when he came home again. Then he took the 2 sheep and cut their throats over the pit, so that the dark blood ran down and gathered in it, and at the smell of that blood the souls of the dead came swarming up out of the dark below. They came in their hundreds and their thousands, with a noise that was not quite a voice, a thin crying that rose on every side of him in the gloom. Young brides came, and unmarried boys, and old men worn out by long lives, and tender girls still new to their grief, and ranks of men killed in war with the wounds of bronze still on them, and their armor still dark with blood, and they pressed in toward the pit from all directions. A green fear took hold of Odysseus at the sight of them, but he held to what he had been told, and he drew his sword and stood it over the blood, and with it he kept the crowding dead back, for any soul that drank would find its voice and its memory again, and he meant to let none of them drink until the prophet had come and spoken. The first to reach him was Elpenor, the boy who had fallen from the roof, his body still lying unburned and unburied back in Circe's house, for they had left in too great a haste to see to him. He wept and begged Odysseus not to sail off and leave him there, unmourned, with no grave and no rites, lest the anger of the gods come down on the living for the neglect of him. He asked that when they went back to the island, as he knew they would, they burn his body with his armor and raise a mound for him on the grey shore and plant his oar upright on top of it. The oar he had pulled while he lived. Odysseus gave him his word that all of it would be done. Then his own mother came up out of the dark, Anticlea, and the sight of her stopped the breath in him, for she had been alive and well when he sailed for Troy, and he had not known that she had died. The tears ran down his face to see her there among the shades, and yet even so he would not let her come to the blood and drink, hard as that was to do, because Circe had warned him that the prophet must drink before any other. So he held even his own mother back at the point of his sword and waited, and she sat near the pit and looked at him and said nothing, not yet knowing her own son. At last the shade of Tiresias came, holding a golden staff, the blind prophet who alone of all the dead still kept his understanding whole. He knew Odysseus at once and asked why he had left the sunlight to come down to this joyless place. And then he stooped and drank the dark blood, and when he had drunk, he told the truth of what lay ahead. The Lord of the sea was bitter against him, the prophet said, for the blinding of his son, and would make the way home long and cruel, but they might all yet come through it alive, if they could only master themselves at one place above the rest. They would reach an island where the cattle of the sun grazed, fat herds belonging to the God who sees and hears everything that happens under the sky. And if they left those cattle untouched, for all their hunger, they might still come home to Ithaca, battered but breathing. If they laid hands on the cattle, the prophet saw nothing but ruin. The ship would be smashed and the crew drowned, and Odysseus alone would live and would come home late and broken on a stranger's ship to find proud men eating his house bare and courting his wife, and those men he would have to deal with. There was more, for the prophet saw past the killing in the hall to the very end of the long story. After Odysseus had dealt with the men in his house, he was to take up a shapely oar and carry it inland, away from the sea, walking on and on until he came at last to a people who knew nothing of the sea at all, who put no salt on their food and had never set eyes on a ship, and who, meeting him on the road, would take the oar on his shoulder for a fan to winnow grain. There he was to fix the oar upright in the ground and make his peace with the Lord of the sea by sacrifice, and then turn for home. And his own death, when it finally came, would come to him gently off the water in a sleek old age, with his people prosperous and at peace around him. That was the whole of it, the prophet said, and he turned and went back down into the house of the dead. Now Odysseus let his mother come to the blood, and when she had drunk it, she knew him, and she wept and called him by his name, and asked how he, a living man, had found his way down into the dark. He asked her in turn how she had died, and whether his father still lived, and his wife and his son, and whether his place was being kept for him at home. She answered all of it. His wife Penelope was still in his house, she said, holding on and weeping through the long nights and the long days, her honor not yet broken. His son held the lands. His old father Laertes had left the town and gone out to live on the farm in his sorrow, sleeping in the ashes by the hearth through the winter and on the bare ground among the vines in summer, an old man dressed in rags and aching for his son to come home. And she herself had died of none of the sicknesses that carry people off. It was her grief for him, her long aching over the years that he did not return, that had loosened her grip on life and killed her. 3 times he reached out to gather her into his arms, and 3 times she passed straight through them and left him holding nothing, and his grief turned sharp and confused, and he asked her why she fled him, whether she was only some phantom the queen of the dead had sent to torment him. She told him the truth of the dead. This was no trick. It was only what becomes of everyone when the fire has eaten the body away, that the spirit comes loose and drifts off, and there is no longer anything of a person left to take hold of, nothing solid, only the shape of who they had been. She told him to carry the memory of all this back up into the light and tell it to his wife, and the speaking of it was a kind of goodbye. Many other souls came up to the blood and spoke with him, famous women of the old days and men he had fought beside. The saddest of all of them was Agamemnon, the great king who had led the whole army to Troy and broken the city and sailed home in triumph, only to be cut down at his own homecoming feast by his wife and the man she had taken to herself while he was away at the war, slaughtered among his people with no chance to lift a hand. His ghost wept as he told it. He warned Odysseus to come home quietly and let no one know his ship had landed, to trust no welcome and no smiling face. Then he caught himself and allowed that Odysseus' own wife was wise and good and would never do such a thing. But even so, he said, Come home in secret, and let the homecoming be careful." He had not been careful, and he asked Odysseus to look where it had left him. Then came Achilles, the greatest fighter who ever lived, dead under the walls of Troy, at the very height of his glory. Odysseus greeted him as a man surely blessed, told him that in life he had been honored as a god, and now, beyond doubt, he ruled as a great lord among the dead, and that he had no cause to grieve at dying. Achilles would have none of it. He told Odysseus to spare him the pretty speeches about death. He would rather be alive and bound to the soil as the hired man of some landless, struggling farmer, breaking his back for a poor master with little to eat, than be king over all the breathless dead in that whole grey kingdom. Glory counted for nothing down here. Better the meanest life under the sun than the lordship of the dead. But he asked after his son, whether the boy had grown into a man of war, and there Odysseus could give him the one thing that gladdened him. His son had been brave at Troy, first into every fight, never once wounded, and had come away from the war alive and whole with his full share of the plunder. At that, the ghost of Achilles went striding off across the field of pale asphodel with long, glad steps, rejoicing in the courage of his son, and it was the only happiness Odysseus carried to anyone in that whole country. One soul stood off by itself and would not come near the blood at all. It was Ajax, the mightiest of the Greeks after Achilles, who had taken his own life in shame and fury when the dead Achilles' armor was given to Odysseus and not to him. Odysseus called across to him gently and tried to make peace, said he grieved for his death and wished the contest over the armor had never been held. Ajax gave him no answer. He turned and walked away into the dark among the other dead without a single word, and his silence weighed more on Odysseus than any curse he might have spoken, and Odysseus let him go. He stayed too long. He would have stayed longer still, to look on the famous dead of the older world, the judges of the dead, and the great sinners at their endless punishments. But the souls were gathering around him now in their countless thousands, and a cold dread rose in him that the queen of the dead might send up some monstrous thing out of the deeper dark for him to look upon, and his courage failed him at the last. He turned back to the ship and called his men aboard and told them to cast off, and they pushed out onto the great river and rowed, and then the current and a following wind took them up and bore them away, and the lightless country and its thin, endless crying fell behind them. Odysseus came back up into the land of the living, carrying everything he had heard down there in the dark, the road ahead and the price set on it, his mother's death, the warning to come home a stranger to his own house, and the man who climbed back into the daylight was not the man who had gone down. They sailed back to Circe's island at dawn, the same green country they had left, and the first thing they did on landing was keep the promise made in the dark. They carried Elpenor's body down to the shore and burned it with his armor, and they heaped a mound of earth over the ashes, and on the top of it they set his oar standing upright, so that anyone passing on the water afterward would see it and know that a man was buried there. Circe came down to meet them, for she had known they would return, and she brought food and wine, and she let the worn-out crew rest and eat their fill that day. And at nightfall she drew Odysseus aside to tell him the dangers waiting between him and home. There would be the sirens first, she said, who sat in a flowering meadow beside the sea and sang so sweetly that every man who heard them turned his ship toward the sound and drove it onto the rocks, and the meadow around them lay white with the bones of the men who had died listening. He must stop the ears of his crew with kneaded wax so that they heard nothing of it. If he wished to hear the song himself and still live, he must have his men bind him upright to the mast and leave him bound however hard he fought, and tie him tighter if he begged to be let go. After the sirens, the sea split into two roads, she told him, and both of them were deadly. One way ran between cliffs where a thing called Charybdis lived that sucked the whole sea down into itself 3 times a day and spat it up again, and no ship caught in that pull was ever saved. The other side of the same narrow channel rose in a sheer cliff with a cave high up in it, and in the cave lived Scylla, a monster with 6 long necks and 6 heads full of teeth, who reached down as ships passed below and plucked men off the decks, 6 at a stroke, 1 for every mouth. There was no fighting her, for she was deathless and could not be killed. The hard truth, Circe said, was that he must steer in close under Scylla's cliff and accept the loss of 6 men and row past as fast as the oars would carry him, since to lose 6 was bitter, but to drift toward Charybdis was to lose the ship and every soul aboard it. And last, she said, he would come to the island of the sun, where the god pastured his deathless cattle and his flocks of sheep under the eyes of his daughters. Whatever else befell them, he must not let his men touch those animals. If they left the herds alone and kept their hands clean, hungry as they were sure to be, they might all still reach home. If they killed even one of the cattle of the sun, she foretold the loss of his ship and his crew, and warned that he himself, if he lived at all, would come home late and alone and a broken man. He had heard the very same thing from the dead prophet, and now he heard it again from the goddess, and he carried both warnings with him when they put to sea at dawn. When the ship drew near the meadow of the sirens, the wind dropped of its own accord, and the sea went flat and still, and the men furled the sail and took to the oars. Odysseus cut a great round of wax into pieces and worked them soft in his hands, and stopped the ears of every man aboard, and then he had them lash him to the mast, hand and foot, standing upright, and he told them that whatever he did and however he pleaded, they were to row on and not loose him, and to bind him harder if he ordered them to set him free. So they rowed, hearing nothing, and he stood bound and listening. The sirens saw the ship and lifted their voices and sang straight to him by name. They sang that they knew all things, everything that had happened at Troy and everything that happened anywhere under the sky, and that any man who stayed to listen would sail on the wiser for it. The song was the sweetest sound he had ever heard or would ever hear again, and it took hold of his heart and wrung it. and he strained against the ropes and screamed at his men and twisted his face at them to come and untie him. They heard none of it. 2 of them rose and drew the ropes tighter and bound him faster to the mast, as he had told them to do. And the rowers bent their backs and drove the ship on past the meadow, and the singing slid away behind them and faded at last into silence. Only then did they dig the wax from their ears and free him from the mast. They were not long out of the calm when they saw smoke and a great heaving surf ahead, and heard a roar of water, and the men were so frightened that the oars dropped from their hands. This was the narrow channel. On one side the sea boiled where Charybdis dragged it down, bearing black sand at the very bottom of the pit when she drank, and roaring as it went, a sound of something in torment. And Odysseus steered hard away from that side and held close under the cliff where Scylla waited. He had warned the crew about the whirlpool. He had said nothing at all to them about the monster overhead, for he knew that if they saw what was coming, they would let go the oars and cower down in the hull, and the ship would drift and be lost. And so he let them pull hard under the cliff, with no idea of what hung above them. He had put on his armor and stood watching the whirlpool and dreading it, and while every eye was fixed on Charybdis, Scylla struck from the other side. She reached down out of her cave and snatched 6 men off the deck in a single sweep, the 6 strongest hands on the ship, and hauled them up into the air, still writhing. Odysseus heard them screaming his name as they were lifted, and saw them held high against the cliff and dragged kicking toward her mouths, their arms stretched down toward him, and there was nothing he could do for them, and no way to bring the ship about, and he had to row on and leave them to her. Of all the terrible things he saw in all his years upon the water, he said, that was the most pitiful, his own men calling out to him by name while a monster fed on them, and he kept rowing. Past the strait, worn down and grieving, they came in sight of the island of the sun, and from far off across the water, Odysseus could already hear the lowing of the cattle and the bleating of the sheep in their pastures. The warnings of the dead prophet and of the goddess came back to him both at once, and he told the crew they must row straight on past this island and not set foot on it for any reason. But the men had had enough. Eurylochus spoke up against him in front of them all, and called it a cruel and pitiless thing to deny worn-out men a single night ashore to rest and cook and sleep on solid ground, said they were exhausted past bearing and the dark was coming on, and the sea grew dangerous at night. The whole crew took his side. Odysseus saw that he could not win it alone against the lot of them, and he gave way. But first he made every man swear a solemn oath that they would lay no hand on any cow or sheep they found on the island, and would eat only the food Circe had given them. They swore it, and they landed, and they camped beside a spring, and ate from their own stores and slept. In the night a storm came up, and by morning the wind was blowing hard out of the wrong quarter, and it did not stop. For a whole month the gale blew and pinned them on the island, and they could not put to sea against it. As long as the food and wine from Circe lasted, they kept their oath and let the cattle be. But the stores ran out, and then the men were driven to roaming the island with bent hooks and nets, fishing and snaring birds, anything to put in their bellies, and the hunger wore them thinner day after day. Odysseus went off alone one afternoon to a place out of the wind to pray to the gods for a way home, and the gods answered by drawing his eyes shut and laying a heavy sleep on him, and while he slept, the thing he had dreaded came to pass. Eurylochus chose that hour to talk the others round. Every death is hateful, he told them, but the most wretched death of all is to starve, and starving was what they were doing. Better to take the best of the sun's cattle and offer a proper sacrifice of them to the gods. And if the sun was angry for the loss of his beasts and meant to wreck the ship for it, then better to die quickly in the water with a full belly than to waste away by inches on this shore. The starving men heard him and agreed. They rounded up the finest of the cattle and cut their throats and made what poor offering they could, with oak leaves in place of the barley they no longer had, and water in place of wine. And they cut up the carcasses and set the meat to roast. Odysseus woke and caught the smell of roasting meat on the wind, and he knew in that moment what they had done, and he cried out to the gods in despair, for it was already far too late to undo it. And the gods sent signs that the crime had been seen. The flayed hides of the cattle crawled along the ground, and the meat on the spits, raw and roasted alike, began to low with the voices of living cattle, so that the dead beasts seemed to be bellowing all around the camp. The men feasted regardless. For 6 days they ate the cattle of the sun, since hunger had burned the fear out of them, and on the 7th day the storm at last fell still. Up in the sky the sun had seen all of it, as he sees all things, and he went in a fury to the Lord of the gods and demanded justice for his slaughtered cattle, and he swore that if he was not paid for them, he would go down and shine among the dead instead of over the living. The Lord of the gods told him to keep shining where he was, and promised that the men who had done it would pay in full. He would split their ship with a thunderbolt out on the open sea and drown every one of them. When the wind had turned fair, the survivors put out and left the island behind, glad to be moving, the stolen meat already inside them. They had not gone far. Once the island had sunk out of sight, and there was nothing but water on every side. The Lord of the gods drew a black cloud over the ship, and the day went dark, and a shrieking wind came down and snapped the mast, and the falling mast crushed the steersman's skull, and then a thunderbolt struck the ship square and filled it with fire and the reek of sulfur, and the men were flung out into the sea. They went under in the waves around the wreck and did not come up again, every last one of them, and that was the end of the crew of Odysseus, all the men who had followed him out of Troy, paying with their lives for a single act of hunger on a forbidden shore. Odysseus alone was left alive. He lashed the broken mast and the keel, together with a leather rope, as the ship fell apart under him, and he climbed astride the timbers and was carried off helpless before the storm. The wind shifted and drove him back toward the narrow channel he had come through, and he saw with horror that he was being swept straight down onto Charybdis, just as she opened her throat and sucked the whole sea down. His raft of timbers went down into the pit with the water, but he had sprung clear as it dropped, and he caught hold of the branches of a great fig tree that grew out from the cliff above the whirlpool, and he clung there with no footing under him, and the timbers gone down into the dark below, and he waited. He hung there the better part of a day, until Charybdis at last spewed the sea and the wreckage back up out of her depths, and his mast and keel came shooting to the surface, and he dropped down onto them and rowed away with his bare hands and got clear before she could drink again. For 9 days he drifted on the open sea on those 2 timbers, alone, with no food and no water and no land anywhere in sight. On the 10th night the gods carried him to an island, and he crawled ashore more dead than living, and the goddess who lived there took him in. Her name was Calypso, and the island was Ogygia, and there he stayed for 7 years. And there, said Odysseus, in the bright hall of the Phaeacians, he would stop, for the rest of it they already knew. They knew how he had left the goddess at last, and built his raft, and been wrecked once more by the Lord of the Sea, and how he had washed up naked on their own shore, and been found by the princess at the river. He had told the whole of it now, from the day Troy fell to the day he came to them, and the whole sat silent around him, and the fire had burned down low, and no one moved to speak. They had asked the stranger who he was. Now they knew. The Phaeacians kept their word. They laid him sleeping in their swift ship and carried him over the water in a single night, and they set him down on the shore of Ithaca with the gifts they had given him piled beside him, and they sailed away before he woke. He opened his eyes on his own country after 20 years and did not know it, for Athena had wrapped the land in mist, and only when she came to him and lifted it did he understand that he was home. She warned him not to rejoice. His house was full of his enemies, 100 proud men, eating his wealth and pressing his wife to marry. And if he walked in as himself, they would cut him down. So the goddess aged him into a ragged old beggar, bent and grey, and sent him first to the hut of his old swineherd, the one servant who had stayed loyal, and there his son Telemachus, newly home from his own searching, came to him. When they were alone, Athena gave him back his true shape for a moment, and the father and the son who had never known each other wept in each other's arms, and together they laid their plan. He went up to the hall in his rags and let the suitors mock him and throw things at him, and he watched and waited and learned which men had kept faith and which had not. His old hound, lying neglected on a dunghill, lifted his head and knew his master after 20 years, and wagged his tail once and died. Penelope did not know him. She came down among the suitors and said she could hold them off no longer, and set them a contest. She would marry whichever man could string the great bow of Odysseus and shoot an arrow clean through a row of axe heads, which only her husband had ever done. One by one the suitors tried the bow, and not one of them could so much as bend it to the string. Then the ragged beggar asked for his turn, They jeered, but Telemachus had the bow put into his hands, and the old stranger turned it over once and strung it without effort, smooth and quick, and sent the arrow straight through every axe head down the line. Then he threw off his rags. The doors were already barred. Telemachus stood at his side, and the loyal servants with him, and Odysseus turned the bow on the men who had devoured his house, and shot down the worst of them where he stood. And what followed in that hall was long and bloody and without mercy. When it was over, not one of the suitors was left breathing, and the house was his again. But the killing was not the homecoming. Word was carried up to Penelope that the beggar was her husband and the suitors were dead, and she came down and sat across from him and would not say that it was him. She had survived 20 years by trusting nothing, and she would not be fooled now by a god wearing his face. So she set him one last test of her own. She told a servant within his hearing to move their marriage bed out of the chamber and make it up for the stranger to sleep on. And Odysseus, who had held his temper through everything, lost it. That bed could not be moved, he said, for he had built it himself around a living olive tree rooted deep in the ground, and carved one post from its trunk, and no man alive could shift it unless he first cut it free. No one in the world knew that, but the two of them. Then she ran to him and threw her arms around his neck and wept, and begged him not to be angry that she had been so slow and so careful. And he held her and wept too, the wife he had crossed the whole world to reach. The two of them had each survived alone by never once lowering their guard, and now, at the very end of it, each had found the one person in the world they could lower it for. Outside, the long night held on, for Athena kept the dawn back a while longer and gave them their time.